My name is Walter Ashford. I'm 68 years old, and until 3 months ago, I believed my son loved me. I built Ashford Marine Logistics out of a rusted-out shipping container and a stack of overdue invoices. 41 years later, it moves cargo for half the ports on this coast. I gave my son everything I never had, and on my 68th birthday, I found out exactly what he thought I was worth. I had a reservation at the finest steakhouse in Port Meridian. I sat there with a glass of scotch I didn't want, and across the dining room, I watched my only child laugh with his wife and his mother-in-law. The same son who told me 2 hours earlier that he couldn't make it because he was buried in permits. I didn't yell. I didn't cause a scene. I walked over, picked up the company card sitting on their table, and I bent it in half with my bare hands. Then I went home and I opened my laptop. Before I tell you what I found buried in that company's books and what they had planned for the rest of my life, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. Hit that like button, and if you're new here, subscribe now, because if you've ever had family look you dead in the eye and lie, this story is going to feel personal. It was a Tuesday evening in October, just past 6 o'clock. I was sitting in my corner office on the 11th floor of the Ashford building, looking out over the harbor lights, the same view I'd been staring at since we broke ground in 1998. It was my birthday, 68 years old. Not a milestone anyone throws a parade for, but I'd hoped for something simple, a decent meal with my son, Preston. Preston was 34, my chief operating officer, and for better or worse, the only immediate family I had left since my wife passed 6 years earlier. I picked up my desk phone and dialed his extension. He picked up on the 4th ring, and I could hear the theater in his voice before he even said hello. "Dad, hey, listen, I am so sorry. I meant to call you," he said, and I could hear papers shuffling, the kind of shuffling a man does when he wants you to hear it. The Meridian Terminal expansion permits got kicked back by the Port Authority again. I've got red lines on 3 different contracts, and I'm going to be here until midnight, probably. I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, the one a father feels when he already suspects he's being managed. But I pushed it down, the way I always did. "It's my birthday, son," I said, keeping my tone light. "Thought we could grab a steak at Corbin's. My treat, obviously." He let out a heavy sigh, the kind you'd expect from someone being asked to carry a piano up a flight of stairs, not from a grown man being invited to dinner by his father. I know, and I feel terrible. Can we do it this weekend instead? I'll make it up to you, I promise. Happy birthday, Dad. Love you." The line went dead before I could answer. I sat there a long moment, the hum of the building's ventilation the only sound in the room. I thought about all the nights I'd missed when Preston was a boy, little league games I skipped because I was in a bank office begging for a loan, school plays I missed because I was on a dock somewhere at 2 in the morning making sure a shipment didn't rot in customs. I told myself that if he was drowning in permits tonight, the least I could do was let him drown in peace. That's the story I told myself anyway. I wasn't going to sit in my empty house and microwave a birthday dinner for one. I grabbed my coat, took the elevator to the garage, and drove to Corbin's Chop House alone. Corbin's was the kind of place where the maitre d' knew my name before I gave it. Low lighting, the smell of seared beef and good bourbon, a quiet string quartet somewhere behind the bar. I'd closed some of the biggest contracts of my career in that dining room. The host, a young man named Julian, greeted me with a warm smile. "Mr. Ashford, happy birthday, sir. Will you be joining the rest of your party tonight?" I stopped walking. "My party?" "Yes, sir. Your son arrived about half an hour ago. We have them at the private booth in the back, just like he asked." Something in my chest went cold and still. like a window had been left open somewhere I couldn't find. I didn't wait for Julian to lead me. I walked through that dining room myself, past couples celebrating anniversaries, past a table of businessmen closing some deal over cigars they weren't supposed to have indoors, until I heard it. My son's laugh, loud and easy, the kind of laugh a man gives when he thinks nobody who matters is listening. I stopped behind a wine column and looked toward the back booth. Preston sat there in a suit I didn't recognize, his tie loosened, a glass of champagne in his hand. Beside him, practically draped over his shoulder, was his wife, Elena. Across from them, holding court like she owned the restaurant, was Elena's mother, Regina. There were 2 silver towers of oysters and king crab on that table, 2 bottles of champagne cooling in ice buckets. Regina was mid-story, waving a crab fork like a conductor's baton, and Elena was laughing so hard she nearly spilled her drink. I'd never cared for Regina. From the day Preston married Elena, Regina had treated my company's money like a family trust fund she was owed a share of. She was always dropping little comments about how a real father would have bought them a bigger house or funded her trip to Portugal. I usually let it go for the sake of peace. Watching her now, laughing with her mouth full of lobster on the night my own son had lied to skip my birthday, something in me finally snapped its patience. "You didn't tell me your father throws such a good party for himself, Preston," Regina said, loud enough that I heard every word. "On a Tuesday, too. Only the best for my girls." "We deserve it," Preston said, raising his glass. "The office has been brutal." Elena giggled. "Is your dad going to notice you slipped out? You know how he gets about his precious schedule." I held my breath, waiting, hoping for my son to say something. Anything. Instead, he rolled his eyes and leaned back into the booth. "Please, my dad's basically checked out at this point. He's off in his own world half the time. Golf, retirement plans, whatever. He bought the permits story without blinking. He has no idea what's actually going on outside his office anymore." The 3 of them laughed together, that sharp, careless laugh people give when they think no one who matters can hear them. I did not feel sad in that moment. I want to be clear about that, because sadness is what I expected to feel. What I actually felt was a switch flipping somewhere behind my ribs, 40 years of boardroom instincts waking up all at once. I have negotiated with hostile buyers, survived 2 recessions, and outlasted men who wanted to bury my company in litigation. I know exactly what it looks like when someone is circling something they think is weak. I had just watched 3 people circle me. I stepped out from behind the column and walked straight toward the booth. I didn't rush. A man who's spent 4 decades in commercial shipping negotiations knows you never run toward a confrontation. You walk into it like you already own the room. Regina noticed me first, mid-sentence, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. Elena's laugh cut off like someone had unplugged it, and Preston, my son, looked up and the color simply drained out of his face. "Dad." His voice came out smaller than I'd heard it since he was 12 years old. What are you doing here?" "It's my birthday, Preston," I said, calm as still water. "I figured I'd treat myself to dinner. Since you told me you'd be buried in permits until midnight, I assumed I'd be eating alone. Imagine my surprise." He started talking fast, the way men do when they're cornered and know it. "Dad, it's not what it looks like. We're entertaining a potential design consultant. Regina knows someone in commercial architecture. We were going over some concepts for the Meridian project. I swear." I looked at the table. Seafood towers, champagne. Not a single folder, laptop, or sketch in sight. "Working," I repeated, quietly. Elena tried next, her voice syrupy and rehearsed.
"Walter, honestly, we didn't want to bother you on your special night. Preston was just trying to handle things so you could relax. Why don't you sit down? We'll get you a glass." I wasn't listening to her anymore. My eyes had landed on the small leather billfold sitting beside Regina's plate, an itemized check resting on top of it. Even from a few feet away, I could read the total: $4,200. And resting directly on top of that check, catching the light of the chandelier, was the black titanium Ashford Marine corporate card. Something cold and very old rose up in my chest. Not sadness. Something closer to fury, with the volume turned all the way down.
I was 30 years old again for just a second, sleeping in the cab of a truck on a construction lot because I couldn't afford both rent and payroll that month. I remembered the ache in my hands from hauling steel cable in freezing weather, remembered walking into 6 different banks in a single week just to get someone to take a chance on me. I built this company so that someday my son would never have to know what that felt like. And here he was, using the fruit of that suffering to fund a seafood tower for a woman who mocked me behind my back. I reached down and picked up the card. Nobody at that table moved. "You should have been reviewing zoning permits tonight, son," I said quietly. "Not spending my company's money entertaining people who think I'm too senile to notice." I gripped the card in both hands and snapped it clean in half. The sound was sharp enough that a few nearby tables turned to look. I set the 2 halves down on Regina's plate, right next to her half-eaten lobster tail. "Happy birthday to me," I said. "You can pay for the rest yourselves." And I turned and walked out of that restaurant without looking back. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and silence. By the time I pulled through my own gate, the adrenaline had already burned off, and what was left underneath it was something far colder and much more useful. I led myself into my study, poured 2 fingers of bourbon I never touched, and sat down in the dark. My mind, the same mind that had spent 4 decades evaluating hostile buyouts and reading contracts line by line for hidden traps, had already started working the problem. This wasn't really about a missed dinner. It wasn't even about the $4,200. Those were symptoms. The real disease was the entitlement I'd just watched sit at that table like it belonged there. Regina had been feeding off my son's card for who knows how long, completely unbothered. Elena had mocked me to my son's face, and he'd agreed with her. A man doesn't casually swipe a corporate card for a $4,000 dinner in public unless he's done it plenty of times before and stopped being afraid of getting caught. You don't start there. You start small. You test the fence. You only throw a feast like that once you're sure nobody's watching the account anymore. I thought about the last 18 months, Preston brushing off my requests to see quarterly expense reports, telling me he was still consolidating the numbers. I'd let it go every time because I trusted him, because some part of me still saw a boy learning to ride a bike, not a 34-year-old executive with access to company accounts. I didn't sleep that night. By the time the sun came up, I had made a decision. At 6 in the morning, I picked up my phone and called Marcus Doyle. Marcus had been Ashford Marine's lead counsel for over 20 years. He'd stood beside me through 2 hostile takeover attempts and a federal trade dispute that nearly sank us in 2009. He answered on the second ring, already alert, because a call from me before sunrise only ever means one thing. I told him everything. The dinner, the card, the mockery. He listened without a word. When I finished, he let out a slow breath. "I want a full forensic review of every transaction Preston has authorized in the last 2 years," I told him. "Bypass the internal finance team completely. I want outside eyes only, and I want it quiet. If he has help inside the company, I don't want anyone tipped off." Marcus promised to have a preliminary report on my desk by noon. I hung up, poured the untouched bourbon down the drain, and waited. Preston knocked on my office door at 9:15 the next morning, carrying 2 coffees, wearing yesterday's rumpled suit like a costume of exhaustion. "Morning, Dad," he said, setting a cup in front of me. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to see." "Good morning, Preston," I said, keeping my voice perfectly neutral. He sat down across from me and delivered what I can only describe as a masterclass in false remorse. He told me it hadn't really been about permits at all. Regina had shown up unannounced. Elena had begged him to keep the peace, threatened to take the kids to a hotel if he ruined her mother's visit. He said he panicked, lied about work because he didn't want to hurt my feelings on my birthday by admitting his in-laws came before me. "And the card?" I asked quietly. He said Regina had ordered half the menu before he could stop her, that he'd panicked again, used the company card because he didn't have the cash on him, that he fully intended to reimburse the company that morning. It was a good story. If I hadn't stood behind that column and heard him call me a clueless old man with my own ears, I might have believed every word of it. I stood, walked around my desk, and put a hand on his shoulder. The hand of a father offering forgiveness he did not feel. "You should have just told me the truth, son," I said, warmth I had to dig for filling my voice. "Marriage means compromise. Reimburse the account by Friday, and we'll put it behind us. We'll celebrate properly this weekend." Relief washed over his face so fast it was almost insulting. "Thank you, Dad. I promise, no more lies." "I know you won't," I said. "Now go get cleaned up. We've got a shipment schedule to review." He left with his confidence fully restored, certain he'd successfully managed the clueless old man one more time. The moment the door clicked shut, my expression dropped. I poured his coffee into the potted fern by the window. I would not drink a peace offering bought with stolen money. 40 minutes later, Marcus came in through my private elevator, carrying a stack of documents easily 6 inches thick. "Good morning, Walter," he said, dropping the pile on my desk. "The shadow audit you asked for." "That fast?" "I used the backdoor access protocol we set up after the 2009 dispute," he said. "Preston and the finance team have no idea these records were ever pulled." He opened the thickest folder and slid a summary spreadsheet across the desk. The $4,200 dinner bill, the thing that had started all of this, was listed at the very bottom, a rounding error compared to everything above it. "Over the last 14 months, Marcus said, Preston has authorized just over $760,000 in consulting and design fees, all funneled to a single outside vendor, Solstice Interior Consulting." I'd spent 4 decades in commercial shipping and logistics. I knew every reputable design and consulting firm on this coast. Solstice meant nothing to me. "It's a shell," Marcus said. "Incorporated in Delaware 16 months ago. No office, no website, no other clients. It exists for exactly one purpose: billing Ashford Marine." I flipped through the service agreements. Sloppy boilerplate contracts, vague line items like spatial concept development and ambient design consultation. No deliverables, no blueprints, no renderings, just invoices, approved and expedited by my son every single month. "Where's the actual work, Marcus?" I asked. "There isn't any," he said. I pulled his project drives. There's nothing there, just invoices. My son wasn't just entitled. He was actively, deliberately robbing the company I had bled to build. "Who owns Solstice?" I asked. Marcus slid across a Delaware filing. The listed owner was a man named Gerald Finch, a retired auto parts salesman living in a small condo 2 states away. And, Marcus added grimly, Gerald Finch happened to be Regina's cousin. The money didn't stay with Gerald Finch either. It moved into an offshore trust, and from there it funded chartered flights, a diamond upgrade for Elena's wedding ring, a country club membership under Regina's name.
My son wasn't making mistakes. He was running an operation.
I sat with that for a long moment, the paternal grief hitting me in waves before the colder, older parts of my mind took back over. I picked up the phone to call the FBI directly. Marcus stopped me before I could dial. "Wait," he said. "There's something else. My cyber team found something on Preston's personal server last night that has nothing to do with Solstice." He handed me a sealed envelope. Inside was a single wire transfer confirmation, not to Solstice, not to an offshore account, but a direct payment of $40,000 to a private medical practice on the east side of the city. The recipient was a neurologist named Dr. Callum Reeve, a man I'd met once, years ago, at a hospital fundraiser. Polished, expensive, the kind of man who looks at every room like it's full of clients. Why would my son wire $40,000 to a brain specialist? I asked. Is he sick? Is Elena? Marcus shook his head slowly. He's not sick, Walter. We intercepted the correspondence attached to that transfer. That wasn't a medical bill. It was a bribe. The room went very quiet. A bribe for what? To falsify your medical records, Marcus said. Preston, Elena, and Regina have been paying a licensed neurologist to manufacture a diagnosis. Against you. I want to tell you the room spun, that I felt the floor tilt beneath me. It didn't. What I felt instead was a terrible, focused clarity, like a fog burning off all at once. We needed proof of intent, not just suspicious wires. Marcus brought in a man named Reyes, a former federal cybersecurity analyst who now worked in the gray, unregulated space between corporate security and something considerably less legal. He didn't ask questions. He set up on my conference table and went to work. 6 hours later, he had pulled 51 emails and 4 attached documents from Preston's private server. The oldest email was from Regina, explaining to Preston that Dr. Reeve had a gambling debt and needed untraceable cash. Preston had offered him $40,000 up front through Solstice, with another $200,000 promised once the final objective is complete. Then Reyes opened the attachment. It was a full medical dossier, my name, my date of birth, my ID numbers stamped at the top. A fabricated diagnosis of aggressive early-onset cognitive decline. Fictional episodes of memory loss and outbursts. Falsified scan summaries and cognitive scores, all signed under Dr. Reeve's official medical seal. A document that would, on paper, legally declare me unfit to run my own company or manage my own affairs. The most recent message was from Elena, sent 2 days earlier, confirming that the paperwork was finalized. "The trap is set," she wrote. "We should celebrate." That was the dinner. That was what they were toasting at Corbin's while I sat alone with a glass of scotch. Not a design project. My legal erasure. Marcus asked if I wanted him to call the FBI immediately. We had more than enough for arrests that night. Embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy. I told him no, not yet. Arresting them immediately would be mercy, and mercy was the last thing I intended to offer. Preston would lawyer up with my own stolen money, drag it out for years, and likely serve a handful of comfortable years in a low-security facility. Elena would divorce him, take a settlement, and move on. Regina would claim ignorance and walk away untouched. I didn't want them punished. I wanted them ruined, completely, from the inside, by their own greed. I told Marcus we were going to run what I called the Wounded Lion Plan. For the next week, I would perform exactly the decline they'd invented for me. I'd forget names, misplace documents, stumble through meetings, feeding the story Preston had already planted with the board. I wanted him to walk into our upcoming board meeting believing he had already won, ready to present the fake diagnosis and invoke a clause I'd written into our bylaws 30 years earlier,
a medical incapacity proxy allowing the board to transfer executive power if the CEO was certified unfit. I wanted him to commit to that lie in front of every director we had. The higher he climbed on that lie, the harder the fall. Reyes stayed on retainer, monitoring every device connected to Preston, Elena, and Regina. I needed to see every move before they made it.
Before I tell you how the trap actually closed on them, I want to pause for 1 second. If you're the kind of person who believes patience beats revenge every single time, drop a comment right now and tell me what you would have done differently in my position. Would you have called the police that same night, or waited like I did? And if this story has your full attention, smash that like button and make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next is the part everyone in the comments always says they didn't see coming. All right, let's get back into it. For the following week, I played my part flawlessly. I called my assistant by the wrong name. I asked Preston to repeat simple numbers during meetings. I left my office safe cracked open with sensitive files inside, walked away, and let him find it. I complained about missing funds I'd deliberately misplaced myself, only to discover my error an hour later. Reyes's surveillance confirmed it was working. Preston bragged to Elena over text that the stress of the board meeting was accelerating my decline, that he barely even needed Dr. Reeves' paperwork anymore because I was doing his job for him. On the following Monday, I called Preston into my office. I'd left the blinds drawn, my tie loosened, a bottle of generic prescription pills sitting on the corner of my desk where he couldn't miss them. I told him, in a voice I let waver just slightly, that my memory had been failing badly, that the stress of running the company was becoming too much to carry. I slid a bound portfolio across the desk, a prospectus for a commercial development parcel in the northern part of the county, asking price $12 million, projected returns that would make anyone's eyes widen. I don't want the company to hold this one, I told him. I want you to. Consider it an early inheritance. Buy it under your own name, your own company. Ashford Marine will guarantee the loan. His eyes lit up like a man who'd just been handed a winning lottery ticket. He asked why I wanted it separate from the company. I told him, because I was afraid of making a catastrophic mistake with my mind slipping, and I didn't want to risk the whole business. I wanted to protect his future before I stepped back. He thanked me, promised to make me proud. He floated out of that office holding the portfolio like a stolen prize. 20 minutes later, Reyes had the recording of Preston's call to Elena and Regina from the back of his car, gloating about how easily he'd extracted a $12 million asset from his failing father. But Regina, ever the shrewd operator, saw a problem. If Ashford Marine formally guaranteed the loan, the board would demand oversight, audits, profit sharing, scrutiny that might expose Solstice. She told Preston to cut the company out entirely and secure the funding themselves, keeping 100% of the profits hidden from the board. Her solution was reckless, almost beyond belief. Mortgage Preston and Elena's fully paid-off estate for the initial liquidity, then use Solstice, which on paper looked like a thriving consulting firm thanks to over $700,000 in fraudulent invoices, as the secondary loan guarantor. It was building a skyscraper on quicksand, but greed is a powerful blindfold. Within 48 hours, they'd secured a predatory private loan, mortgaged their home, and bound Solstice as co-guarantor, completely severing Ashford Marine from the transaction, exactly as I'd hoped. By Friday, both signatures were locked in. They had voluntarily chained their entire fortune to a $12 million anvil, and they'd done it entirely to keep me and my board out of their profits. The following Monday, before sunrise, Marcus arrived at my house with a thick red folder. "It's done," he said. "The county processed the deeds overnight. Preston and Regina are the sole legal owners of the parcel. Ashford Marine is completely, legally severed from the transaction." "Show me the environmental report," I said. He slid across a federal geological survey. On the surface, the property looked like a dream, close to major transit lines, surrounded by growing residential development. But buried in the fine print was the property's real history. An unregulated industrial solvent plant that had operated there decades before any environmental oversight existed, dumping toxic runoff directly into the soil for years before it was paved over and forgotten. 3 weeks earlier, that land had been quietly designated a federal environmental cleanup site. The estimated cost of remediation? $12 million, and climbing, once fines and water table decontamination were factored in. That kind of federal environmental liability doesn't disappear in bankruptcy. Whoever holds the deed owns the debt, permanently, regardless of who caused the contamination. Preston thought he'd stolen a $12 million asset. He had actually purchased a $12 million liability, using his own mortgaged home and a fraudulent shell company as collateral. A shell company that, the moment federal auditors opened its books to collect, would immediately expose every embezzled dollar inside it. They wanted 100% of the profits, I said quietly. So they cut everyone out who might have protected them. Precisely, Marcus said. Their own greed built the wall that keeps this company safe.
The morning of the annual board meeting arrived under a gray sky. I walked in wearing a suit that looked a size too big, my shoulders hunched, playing my final scene. Preston arrived flanked by his attorneys, dressed like a man already measuring the corner office for new furniture. He placed a patronizing hand on my shoulder in front of 2 directors, asking if I was up for today. At 10:30, he stood to address the board. He spoke about my legacy with more warmth than I'd heard from him in years, pure theater, before his voice shifted into rehearsed grief. He described my decline over the past 6 months. He pulled out the fabricated medical dossier, distributed copies down the table, and formally invoked the incapacity clause, requesting an immediate vote to strip me of executive control and hand it to him. The room waited for my reaction. I let out a small laugh instead. I reached under my desk and pressed a button. The double doors at the back of the boardroom opened, and Marcus walked in, flanked by 2 federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division, and, trailing nervously behind them, Dr. Callum Reeve himself, pale and sweating, clutching a folder to his chest. Under a plea agreement to avoid the maximum penalty for his own fraud, Dr. Reeve had agreed to wear a wire during his final call with Regina, confirming the entire bribery scheme on record. The lead agent addressed the stunned board directly, describing the embezzlement scheme running through Solstice, the falsified medical documents, and the $12 million toxic property Preston had just personally, legally chained himself to, entirely outside the company's protection. Preston's face went the color of old paper. He sat down hard, his legs no longer holding him. The second agent walked the length of the table, stopped behind Preston's chair, and asked him to stand and place his hands behind his back.
Just as the cuffs closed, the boardroom doors burst open again. Elena and Regina walked in, Elena holding a chilled bottle of champagne, Regina carrying crystal flutes, both of them clearly expecting to celebrate my removal. They froze in the doorway. The bottle slipped out of Elena's hands and shattered on the floor. I didn't offer either of them a shred of mercy. I told the room that these 2 women had helped orchestrate a $760,000 embezzlement scheme, and that the private bank behind their toxic land purchase had already triggered a default clause the moment the fraud came to light. Their mortgaged estate had been foreclosed that same morning. They were, as of that hour, homeless, and the federal government was already moving to seize what remained of their assets to cover a fraction of the $12 million cleanup debt they now personally owed. Preston fell to his knees on the boardroom floor, begging me to fix it, to use the company's money to save his home, to remember that he was my son. "You stopped being my family," I told him, "the moment you decided to erase me from my own life." Regina screamed that she couldn't go to prison, that her reputation would be destroyed. A second federal agent stepped forward with a warrant bearing her name and informed her flatly that the Bureau wasn't concerned with her reputation, only the $760,000 she'd helped steal. Elena, who had kept her name off the official paperwork, avoided immediate arrest, but she left that building with nothing but the clothes on her back. Her home was gone. Her accounts were frozen. Her mother and husband were being led out in handcuffs in front of the entire board. I stood at the window of my office that evening and watched the federal vehicles pull away from the curb, carrying what remained of my family toward a reckoning they'd built entirely with their own hands. I called Marcus and told him to draft the paperwork disinheriting Preston completely, to restructure Ashford Marine's ownership so a meaningful share went to the employees who had actually built this company alongside me, and to set up a scholarship fund for young people with nothing but ambition and no inheritance to lean on, the kind of start I once had myself. I poured a glass of bourbon, the first drink I'd actually let myself enjoy in weeks, and I stood there in the quiet of my office, feeling something I hadn't expected. Not grief, not triumph exactly, just a clean, breathable kind of peace. I lost my only son to a disease more common than people like to admit: greed. But I kept the one thing that mattered more than blood, the legacy I bled 40 years to build, protected from the people who thought I was too old and too foolish to notice them circling it. Family is not an excuse to tolerate betrayal. Love your children, give them everything you can, but never mistake your own generosity for a blindfold. If they show you exactly what they think of you, believe them the first time. If this story reminded you that karma always collects its debts eventually, hit that like button right now, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and drop a comment below. Would you have called the police immediately, or run the long game like I did? I read every single comment, so tell me what you'd have done in my position.